Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm going to be recording my portion of the PILC conference panel that I was going to be on, and I'll just dive right in. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see my presentation. There we go. So I'm going to be talking about how to set up your organizations to be inclusive, focus on equity first, and value LGBTIQA2 plus employees and supporters. So our society and therefore our organizations are set up to default to cisgender, heterosexual, and white normativity. This can lead to a microaggressive or even hostile workplace for LGBTIQA2 plus employees. And, then it gets passed down to our supporters as well. The good news is that if we make the time and we put forth the effort to do so, we can set up our organizations to be inclusive, to focus on equity first, and work toward cultural competencies that value and retain LGBTIQA2 plus employees and supporters. So I'm going to discuss ways to set up organizations at their bones. So how to make an employee's experience inclusive from the application process and beyond, and discuss specific cases in my experience where this hasn't happened and what it feels like to be on the receiving end of bias and bigotry in the environmental field when you work in it. So first I want to talk about my intersections for a second because it affects how I see this issue. I'm trans non-binary, pansexual, mixed race, separated indigenous, probably from the Huron-Wendat Nation. And in all cases, I pass for the majority culture. So I can choose to pass for cisgender, I can choose to pass for heterosexual, and I do pass as white. So how I navigate workspaces will be different than someone who lives at different intersections and can't pass for the privileged population. So I want to put that out as a disclaimer. My perspective will be different than other people's perspectives because of the intersections that I live in. So before we can really talk about things that we can implement to make workplaces better, it's really important to realize that the first step for any organization would be to take a real honest look at where our organizations are. I think this quote from James Baldwin encapsulates it perfectly. So not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So too many organizations want to skip the step. When you do, sometimes you end up with optical allyship that puts band-aids on problems to appear to be woke and ready for marginalized people, but end up harming and losing the talent once the talent experiences the actual culture. So what ends up happening is that people come into an organization thinking their opinions are welcome and requested because that's what's being advertised, but soon realize that they are there to be merely window dressing, which sounds harsh, but I've had it happen, it's true. People want the optics of our identities and in some cases our skin tones, but they don't want us and they don't accept what we bring to the table. So then we end up leaving. So there needs to be an internal evaluation of systems of oppression at your organization, ideally from an outside contractor who does that sort of thing. They'll know what to look for. Um, so things that need to be analyzed are the ideologies of the organization. So finding out what biases got operationalized over time and evaluating how your organization adheres to a white, cisgender, heterosexual, abled, Christian normative culture. So, working in the environmental nonprofit field, I think the most common way that uh, like a normative culture gets operationalized is like in a workplace culture of constant urgency due to understaffing and requiring too much from staff. This type of culture prohibits the time needed to do internal inclusivity and justice work and to encourage thoughtful decision making. It also prohibits people from thinking long term or to figure out and mitigate possible microaggressions that might arise in the things that we do normally in a workplace. So a culture built on constant urgency means that the status quo will always be maintained, which means catering to the groups that hold privilege already. To be a truly inclusive and equitable organization, you need to take an honest look at what causes this culture and dismantle it, um, despite the fact that it's largely considered normal in nonprofit work. So it may be normal, but it's also problematic for employees who experience marginalization, especially. For those without a big budget for this kind of work, I know what you're going through. We have a very small organization where I work, but there are tons of free resources like the Human Rights Coalition's Gender Identity and Gender Expression Workplace Review Form. And you can use these free resources if you're brutally honest with yourself about where you're at and where your organization is at. So I've put together a couple web pages with links to most of the things I'm going to be talking about today and some that I haven't or I won't. And that website is just my last name.com. So talbot-heindel.com, TALBOT-HEINDL.com. And there's a link that says Jedi Journey and a sub link that is this presentation specifically. So those resources that I'm talking about today, like the Human Rights Coalition's Gender Identity and Gender Expression Workplace Review Form, will be linked there. Something else that you could do is have community listening sessions where members of the community are asked to weigh in to see what they want to see change in your organization to make it more equitable. And I highly recommend paying those people. It is emotional labor. So once you've found your places that need work, it's important to develop a diversity plan and equity principles that you can implement. And that work will be on an individual case-by-case basis. So unfortunately, there's no answer I can give to you today that will make that happen or that will make your organization jump through that like specific process. So I can give you a parting tip on how to do that process, which is under no circumstance should you have your employees of color and LGBTIQA2 plus employees do this for you. I've been asked and tasked with that a couple of times at a couple different places, and it's so much unpaid emotional labor. So even if you're paying people their hourly budget or their hourly wage, they are taking on a lot of unpaid emotional labor. So get an outside facilitator to do that. Also, people think it won't happen, but a lot of times retaliatory fragility happens, and the people in your organization that do that work get harmed in the process with people kind of relegating them to like troublemakers or whatever. So it happens. Even if you don't think it'll happen in your organization, it will. I promise you. So get an outside facilitator. So after you do that evaluation and you find the bias in your organization, its structure, its C-suite, and your outward communication, then you're ready to take these next steps that I'm going to be talking about today. So without these big picture items being taken care of, it's going to be like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. So you won't see the wound anymore, but the leg still isn't ready to bear any loads. It's still broken. So similarly, your organization may appear to be, and on the surface will be, more affirming to LGBTIQA2 plus employees and supporters, but the bones of the organization will still uphold a cis and het normative culture. That's cisgender and heterosexual. Sorry, cis and het will be my abbreviations. If you're not sure what those are, again, go to my website and it'll be one of the links. There'll be a glossary. So let's get into these next steps. What are they? So before you bring your first trans, non-binary, pansexual employee, such as myself, into the door, let's look at ways that you can focus on equity-first solutions to position descriptions, onboarding, and develop an affirming experience for your employees so they don't have to deal with a workplace that focuses on cisgender, heterosexual, normative nonsense during the day. I'm going to be bringing in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's not the most perfect model in my opinion, because I believe that different personality types and different traumas may mean that different people have different items in the pyramid in a different order. That was a lot. Yeah, so like my belonging needs might be more important to me than my physiological needs, depending on what my experience has been. So it's not the most perfect model, but it's what I'm going to use. It's just a tool, and I'm going to use it as a tool. So as a representative from an organization, you might not think you have a lot to do in the physiological needs. And that's mostly true. but you do have control over the cultural things in place that help your employees feel confident that their physiological needs will be met. And this is very important. You don't want a distracted workforce who's concerned about, air, water, food, shelter, sleep, or clothing while they're trying to do their work. So, and you just don't want, hopefully you don't want your employees to have to worry about those things in general. So for employees who are LGBTIQA2+, this is a huge concern with being out in the workforce. So personally, I've been fired from 2 jobs for my sexual orientation or my, presentation, gender presentation. So content warning, right now I'm going to use a homophobic pejorative in one moment that I was called at work. So skip forward maybe 4 seconds if you want to avoid it, starting now. So one time a store manager straight up said he was firing me for, quote, looking like a dyke, end quote, and upsetting customers. And, I'm not alone in this. Some states didn't have that illegal for a very long time. But at the time that I was called that, it wasn't illegal to do so. So lots of LGBTIQA2 plus people will likely have gaps in employment or those checked boxes for do not contact my supervisor from old places of employment due to this kind of discrimination and bias and due to being fired for being out, for having a certain presentation, or quote, being difficult, or the catch-all quote, not fitting in with company culture, end quote. And some will actually have difficulty getting employment at all due to presentation. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, it'll be more likely for trans women, especially trans women of color, to have a lot of gaps in employment because of these reasons. So people who live at the intersection of many marginalized identities could have larger gaps or more stops in employment, and may have had to leave a job for their mental and emotional well-being, or worse, had to stay in a toxic workplace because they couldn't afford not to. And they will have these fears and they will bring these fears into the workplace. So we can do things at this physiological needs stage to ensure that our LGBTIQA2 plus employees feel that they are going to have these needs met. So as a representative, you can set up a company culture that provides a sense of security that these things won't happen. So having a process for letting go of an employee with full transparency of that process, regardless of your state's laws. So even if your state's laws are crap, you can still make sure that your employees know that they won't be fired down the road for being open or out or having a presentation that doesn't follow cis-het normative law, like culture. So another way you can help is by not having a culture of passion exploitation. So providing a real living wage. So on top of having bouts of joblessness, many LGBTIQA2 plus people will have been, for example, disowned by their families or denied social programs because of their identities, or, denied access to things that jobless or unhoused people would normally have access to. A lot of these things are shut for LGBTIQA2 plus people. That means that the safety nets provided for most workers don't always catch LGBTIQA2 plus people. In my case, that meant that I was unhoused several times, and most of those times I was working. So I worked in an environmental nonprofit one time that had a culture of passion exploitation, and I had to couch surf for a roof over my head and dumpster dive in order to eat. So working as much as I was, I should not have had to worry about where I was going to sleep or how I was going to eat. But setting up a company culture of passion exploitation means that typically white, cisgender, heterosexual, abled people from middle class upbringings will be the only kind of person who will be able to afford working at your organization when, we work so that we can afford other things, not the other way around. And it won't be conducive to people from marginalized communities, at least not for the long run. So they might come to your organization because they care and they have a passion, but if you set up a passion exploitation, then they can't stay. I mean, they can't afford to stay. So In a 2018 survey, 46% of LGBTIQA2 plus workers said that they had to remain closeted at work to get hired at all or to get a promotion. So playing pretend like this will absolutely impact an employee's well-being and their work performance, and prevent them from connecting with the rest of the team. 1 in 5 workers reported that they had been told or had coworkers imply that they should dress in a more binary fashion, either feminine or masculine, depending on the gender assigned at birth. 53% of workers reported hearing jokes about lesbian or gay people at least once in a while at their workplace. 31% of LGBTIQA2 plus employees reported having felt unhappy or depressed at work. And then on top of all that, 30% of transgender people reported being harassed, fired, or mistreated at work. Transgender women of color are more than twice as likely to live in poverty than the general population and 3 times as likely to be unemployed. LGBTIQA2 plus adults have difficult time achieving economic security because of the biases against them. So how can our organizations help and not be part of the problem? First, we can hire people, and that seems obvious, but a common barrier to employment for people from marginalized communities is gatekeeper fragility. And this is the act of having discomfort from thinking about another person's potential discomfort and closing the door to stop it. So, stopping inclusion and gatekeeping resources or opportunities rather than changing. And I've seen this play out in an organization where the leadership lamented having a homogenized workforce, but they were hesitant to hire someone with an identity outside of their own because they were afraid of saying the wrong things and making an ass of themselves. And secondarily, from harming the marginalized person, which I get that part, I don't get the first part. So when I asked them what they were doing to learn how to say the right things, they honestly weren't. Their solution wasn't to learn better and do better and spend time or money or energy to take seminars. It was to withhold employment. And that doesn't help anything. So we can hire people. Secondly, we can offer real competitive wages and be completely transparent about it. There should be a listed method for cost of living increases and salary determination and promotions written right in the handbook. And the reason I say this is there's an organization I know that had a poor compensation package with no method of any of those things in the handbook. So, um, someone, again, passionate about the cause, accepted a position there and moved their family. And this was a queer person, and their compensation package slowly chipped away after being hired to balance the organization's budget. So first it was doing without a payout of money owed, then it was the loss of cost of living increases, and it was incremental. So it was every single year it was like, we don't have it in the budget, we can't give you a cost of living increase. And then it was paying for workplace equipment on personal credit cards and accruing the interest for that. And then they were asked to find their own insurance and would receive a stipend to do so, but it wasn't, um, it was like 75% of the cost of insurance, I guess. And while that may not be a huge ask for white cisgender heterosexual employees from middle class backgrounds, that could financially ruin someone from a marginalized community who may not have had financial security when they started. So there has to be a transparent process to ensure that people who take positions at your organization are going to be fairly compensated. So, speaking of transparency, job postings should have a transparent salary range. Why? So, for one, marginalized people have other things to deal with and are more likely to not have that economic security I mentioned, which means the salary range might be more important to them than the scope of the job itself. They may be passionate about things but can't afford a low income, and they'll need that information in order to prioritize. Second, if you post something like based on experience or worse, ask for salary needs, you will be actively participating in the creation of the wage gap. So white cisgender heterosexual abled men will always value their time more than people who are from marginalized communities, and especially those who are from the intersection of more than one marginalized community. and this is statistics. This isn't just me having an opinion. There are studies that have shown this. So our society has told us that much, and it takes a lot of decolonizing work to get beyond that and for people from marginalized communities to realize their worth. Another aspect of transparency that will help with equity in hiring is putting requirements for positions, including internships, that are real. So too often organizations add things that are like more, it would be nice if the candidate had X than like an actual requirement. And that's a good way to ensure an homogenized workforce as well. So as I said before, LGBTIQA2 plus people tend to have more economic instability, more gaps in employment, more low-level employment, and less opportunity for higher education. So personally, it took me 10 years to complete a bachelor's degree because I had to take time off every few years to work full-time to be able to afford it. And I've been in the environmental nonprofit world for 18 years, but I've only had like lateral entry-level positions on my resume, which is not uncommon for people from marginalized communities. A lot of times we um, only get lateral movement within our field. But that doesn't stop me and other LGBTIQA2 plus people from being perfectly qualified and suitable for other jobs. But it might stop me and them from having inflated requirements met. So another aspect is that people of color and LGBTIQA2 plus people don't tend to apply for jobs where they don't have a list of requirements either, even when it says or relevant experience for the same reasons that we've been talking about. This furthers the employment gap. So if something isn't an actual requirement, don't include it in requirements. Maybe make a section that says it would be nice if candidate had X. So what about safety once we're in the door? A good place, a smart place to start is bathrooms, and preferably non-gendered ones. So story time. When I was more masculine presenting, I was yanked out of a women's bathroom at Union Station in New York City by my collar by a cop. And yeah, I'll just leave that there. Apparently, while I was in there minding my own business in line to use one of the closed stalls, a cisgender woman found a cop and told him that a man was in the women's bathroom and she felt unsafe. By her haughty attitude and how aggressively she got in my face as the cop was pulling me out, she wasn't truly afraid. She didn't feel unsafe. She was asserting her right to challenge my safety for her comfort. And the cop let me go after I showed him my ID that had my gender assigned at birth with, quote, if you didn't dress like this, that wouldn't have happened, end quote. Because who doesn't love a little victim blaming? So bathrooms are a huge deal in the safety of LGBTIQA2 plus people, both cisgender and transgender. And when I say safety, I mean like physical safety as well as mental and emotional well-being and security. At any given time, there's likely a so-called bathroom bill in one or more legislative bodies to prohibit trans people from using one. And there's a lot of people who consider themselves like gender police in gendered bathrooms, and anyone who doesn't conform to a cis or het presentation may be targeted. So make it so that when people give you 8 or however many hours of themselves a day, they don't have to deal with a safety issue like that. The best option is an all gender bathroom with affirming labels. I think we've all seen the mermaid centaur signs or the whatever, just wash your hands signs, and that can be fun and funny for some, but it can feel dismissive to others. So, we aren't mythical creatures. Mermaids don't have to use the bathroom and feel safe and affirmed. I do. The best signs indicate all gender and whether or not it's accessible to people with mobility aids. And my favorite signs announce what's included in the bathroom. So it might just say urinals, stalls, changing tables, accessible stalls, etc. It'll tell me exactly what's in there. So if you are working on creating an all gender remodel, which hopefully you are, hopefully I've convinced you, the gendered bathrooms you have in the meantime should be stocked with what people need, keeping in mind that some men and people who feel safest in the men's restroom menstruate and will need access to the small trash cans and menstrual products in that bathroom. And while we're speaking of menstrual products, if you provide them, call them that, please. They aren't feminine, and people who don't feel empowered or included in the term feminine still use and still need them. So it's unnecessarily exclusionary to refer to them as feminine products. What you absolutely can't do is recruit people who are LGBTIQA2 plus to your organization with the idea that they will be affirmed and then expect them to deal with having to determine their safety levels when they have to use the bathroom or expect them to hold it while at work. So be sure to do this legwork. So other thing to consider, and this one's kind of a biggie, it requires a lot of work. So, but there are resources, and I have put them on that website. Your health insurance should also be inclusive. So check if your insurance company that you contract with explicitly affirms transgender services. There's something called the World Professional Association for Transgender Health's Standards of Care. So that's WPATH. If you want to Google it. So things that they ask, is the plan accessible to all employees so they aren't forced to out themselves to HR to find it, is something to consider. Does the documentation clearly communicate the inclusive insurance options for employees and their dependents? Does the plan ensure in-network specialists for transition-related or affirming care? Does the pharmaceutical coverage adequately cover hormone replacement therapies? Or HRT, or cover for gender affirming surgeries? Does it consider procedures for gender affirmation to be medically necessary with the healthcare provider's approval without your employee having to spend countless hours doing that work? Storytime, content warning, this is going to be about surgeries, so skip maybe 10 seconds if you want to avoid it. A friend of mine had to do a ton of legwork to get his top surgery and did all that work, made sure that it would be covered by insurance, and then found out that placing the nipples was going to be extra. And it's like, this he learned right before the surgery, and it threw everything out of alignment. Of course, he was already nervous about the surgery and then had to worry about you know getting what he needed. So make sure that the healthcare provider provide or considers it gender affirmation to be medically necessary. Um, Other things to consider, are there caps to the coverage? I've actually seen a Denver-based environmental nonprofit's job announcement. I run a page that has that keeps um, like local environmental jobs on a list. I've seen a announcement state that they had a health insurance plan with no deductible. And I wish I had made note of which organization that was so that I could ask them how they did that. And if I ever do find out, I will update that page on the website as soon as I find out. So I'm going to try and ask around. I'll try to update that. I do want to point out that not all trans employees will require or want HRT or surgery, but you should make sure that your insurance covers that sort of care just in case. These are things to take into account when trying to set up your organization to be ready for LGBTIQA2 plus employees and their safety needs. So belonging needs, and I want to say it's really hard to shut off who you are and go it alone as the only employee of color or LGBTIQA2 plus person, or in my case, both, at an organization that you work with if you aren't fully affirmed. And I'm so thankful that I am affirmed at work. I don't know that I could do what I do if I wasn't. And it shouldn't be the responsibility of the employee to enforce affirmation. So you ask them to be there, you have to be able to affirm them. And there are ways that an organization can start affirming from day one. So first things first, I want everyone to check their employee handbook and maybe check your workplace's last job opening post or your volunteer, internship, or job application forms if you have them. And check to see if your LGBTIQA2 plus employees and supporters and volunteers are affirmed there. So does your employee handbook say, quote, he or she throughout? The one I'm working under actually does. And there's a saying in the non-binary community, and it's be they do crimes. So we're often not mentioned in laws or organizations rules because it, most of the time it does say he or she, and therefore, since we're they, we exist outside of the rules. I asked our staff attorney, and he thought that was clever. So edit your employee handbook to say they, if you can, as in multiple employees, or the pronoun to use when you don't know the pronoun. Not my personal pronouns, although it's nice to see them. The reason I say change it to say they and not change it to say he, she, or they is because there are a myriad of neopronouns. So you'll never get them all. Just say they, or alternatively, you can say the employee. So same with your job posts or your volunteer or internship or job applications. Does your handbook have a gender dress code? Gross. Get rid of them. They're harmful and they do nothing helpful. So there's a way of setting up a level of professionalism in dress without having it be gendered. So in the application, it should also include a place for affirming names and pronouns, extra special bonus points for forms that ask which pronouns to use in different circumstances. So it might not be the same under every circumstance. The pronouns I use for internal meetings might not be the same ones I use for external meetings, or external meetings with certain clients. So it's important that there be a system in place for sharing that, and a system in place for updating the information if employees are ready to be out at work or their circumstances change. So for 68% of transgender people, their legal name is not their affirming name. And for 35% of those people, they didn't change it because of the cost, which is another great reason to offer a living wage. See? For 32% of those, they haven't changed it, citing fear that they would lose their jobs or experience harassment if they change their names. So by asking the question from the first day, you are reassuring your employee the organization values equity and affirmation and is willing to do the work whenever they're ready to be out. And that is, I can't even express how that makes someone feel, knowing that when they're ready, they will be affirmed. So onboarding forms should include an opportunity to use affirming names when possible. So examples being email and system logins, employee directories, name tags, business cards. Really anywhere you have the ability to use it, you should be using an affirming name. The only times it should be the legal name, when there is a different affirming name, is when it's a legal constraint, so like insurance forms or licensing, or the employee requests it for their own reasons. And you don't need to know what those are. Just, take your cue um, from your employees. The cultural competency of the organization should reflect inclusion, and the management should be prepared to enforce it. So new hire training must state that the non-discrimination policy includes gender identity and expression. It should cover affirming names. It should cover the importance of respecting people's pronouns, how to ask people what their pronouns are, what to do if you make a mistake, and that your organization has a company culture that affirms everyone. And, if possible, it should be across the board that your staff is encouraged to include their pronouns where you would commonly see it for trans people and non-binary people, such as, like, if you're in a meeting or whatever and you do introductions, you could say name and pronouns are what you're sharing, or like in your signature line for your email, maybe your pronouns are there as well. So employees should also be informed that they should not assume gender, they should not assume pronouns, sexual orientation, including the super common assumption of the gender of the significant other. I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, what's your husband do? And in my case, that's a true statement. I do have a husband, but, I'm pansexual. It could have been anyone, really. So supervisors and managers should be taught to center equity in addressing problems. When an LGBTIQA2 plus employee reports an incident, the supervisor should be prepared to affirm them. So often, if the supervisor is cisgender and heterosexual, they can empathize with the offending coworker because they could see themselves in that same position. And that happened to me, and I didn't report anything to that supervisor after that. And not because there weren't further issues. There were issues every day, but because I understood that the fragility that the supervisor had in realizing that they could also um, be called out on something like this was leading to was leading that organization. So, that person and their fragility was leading the path that my complaint would take. um, my issue would not be heard or resolved. So I just dealt with it, I guess, and job searched when I got home at night. So, and I want people to think about beyond their own organization too. So, since more environmental nonprofits don't work in a vacuum, there needs to be a culture of affirmation in the coalitions that you work in, and that affirmation should come in the coalitions and from your organization if need be. So, leadership within your own organization should be prepared to and happy to affirm you in your coalitions and head those difficult conversations when you're attacked. So, story time. In one of the coalitions that my organization belongs to, an email went around about signing a letter opposing the Department of Interior's removal of sexual orientation protections in the non-discrimination guidelines. So I saw that email come through, and it was so affirming to see. It was so beautiful. Of course, there were a few people who pushed back and claims that it was outside of our mission since we're an environmental coalition. So, as an out person in my organization, I really wanted to see our leadership respond. And I know that I'm affirmed in my organization, but seeing the conversation happen without my leadership chiming in didn't feel great, especially since I had spoken out as an individual from the LGBTIQA2 plus community in question. So, when I saw that email come through, I can't tell you how amazing it felt. So it was just a short and sweet email saying that we as an organization would definitely be happy to sign on to that letter, but it meant a lot to be affirmed publicly in that coalition. I do want to take a second to address pushback a little bit because I feel like it needs to be addressed. I feel like it's a common thing that we hear. So the pushback was on the claim that it was political in nature to support LGBTIQA2 plus people. But I want to say that when organizations or coalitions consider LGBTIQA2 plus needs to be political, what they're actually saying is that heterosexual and cisgender needs are normal, and our needs are extra. And that normalizing is political too. That didn't happen in a vacuum. That happened with like a history of stigmatizing, making certain identities illegal for a time, making some of it considered mental health issues, considering equal rights for those identities to be something that the majority can vote on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's become politicized. Before anyone says that this stuff is all new and we have to get used to it, I also want to address that because that's a common thing I hear. Heterosexual and cisgender normativity is a result of colonization. So before this society and before these environmental organizations existed, all across Turtle Island, there were tribes and nations that had space for more than two binary genders. So, we had war, we had colonization, we had forced assimilation, and those traditions were almost wiped out, but some tribes and nations were able to keep their traditions going. And the Pan-Indian movement decided in 1990 to reclaim Two-Spirit identity and make space for those traditions across the diaspora. So to ignore those traditions or claim them as new and consider the dominating Western binary as normal is further colonization. So let's just try and avoid it. Okay, off the soapbox. As you probably know, I'm trying to decolonize my experience as I'm reaching out to my nation. So anyway, um, we got inclusive healthcare and the safety needs, but I think that we need to include documented gender transition guidelines and the belonging needs. So having guidelines accessible to employees so they don't have to out themselves to read them is really great. Having the guidelines, period, helps your HR team adjust when an employee transitions. The guidelines should include what accommodations the organization will make, what the transitioning employee can expect from management, expectations for staff in affirming the employee once they start their transition, how to adjust personnel and administrative records, and how to communicate to coworkers and clients about the changes per the employee's needs and wants. These are all things that could be included. And I have a couple of resources on that webpage of example transition guidelines. So let's move on to esteem needs. While a lot of these needs can look like belonging needs, I think it goes a step further when you get to esteem. So this is where coworkers are encouraged and given materials to review on how to be open-minded and affirming to their coworkers, especially those that are transitioning after hire. So I created my own esteem needs for my coworkers to review, and it's really made a huge difference because I get that even though this isn't new for some people, it is relatively new to their understanding, and I'm happy to provide resources. um, so ideally the organization, well, I don't even want to say ideally, the organization and coworkers should demonstratively value equity over money. So in a lot of companies, LGBTIQA2 plus people have been asked to endure dehumanizing conditions from clients, donors, volunteers, or coalition partners for the sake of the cause. So to endure homophobic or transphobic commentary because the person making it brings in a lot of money. They should never be asked to do this. And the LGBTIQA2 plus employees should be able to count on the C-suite leadership to speak out for them. They should not have to navigate these issues on their own unless they would prefer to. So I think it's important also to note that you should take your cue from the person being harmed always, but be prepared to get in the muck, I guess. Your marginalized employee should not have to navigate that on their own. Um, Other staff should know that when corrected on a name or pronoun, they should be expected and aware of the expectation to apologize and course correct. They should know it's important not to make a big deal about it so that the harm party feels like they have to make the coworker feel better. I can't tell you how many times that's happened to me where people keep apologizing until you tell them that it's no big deal. And it is a big deal, but you just want them to stop apologizing. It can also draw more attention to the person being dead named or mispronounced, which can be more harmful. So they should learn to apologize quickly or thank the person for reminding them, repeat the correct pronoun, and move on. So those materials can be in the employee handbook so that coworkers know how to navigate that situation. So on a higher level, LGBTIQA2 plus people should be listened to and trusted as content experts in their own experience. No one outside of their experience should be talking over them when they're sharing their lived experience or how they would like the company to navigate their personal affirmation. So after all, they are living it. And by listening and trusting, cisgender and heterosexual coworkers can learn how to create a more affirming company culture and a more affirming space for that person. So lastly, we have self-actualization needs. The best example I have for this is me being given the opportunity by other organizations, my own organization, to give talks on this topic. So my workplace recognized my unique experience and expertise on the matter and paid me my salary to teach about affirming pronouns during a recent Jedi journey session. Oh, I should take a second. Jedi, I know I mentioned it before. Jedi is justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. And because I'm a huge nerd, Jedi. I didn't come up with it though, but I am going to attach myself to it. So, yeah, I got paid to teach about affirming pronouns during a Jedi journey session for that coalition I was talking about earlier. And my company also offered to be guinea pigs for me to test my presentations on because it's been like a decade since I've taught or like spoken before. I hope this is the first time you're realizing that. My coworker sat in on a conference call because I was nervous about asserting my needs regarding, you know, teaching Jedi journeys. So my coworkers trust me when I say that certain phrasing could be problematic to certain audiences, and when I suggest alternative phrasing. And I think the act of support and trust is huge in self-actualization needs. So it would be easy for an environmental nonprofit to say that this is outside of our mission and tell me they won't pay me to do these presentations and I need to do it on my own time. But as an affirming organization, they recognize that social justice is a huge part of environmental justice and realize that as an LGBTIQA2 plus employee who's been through it a couple of times, I need to speak out to make sure that the next generation or, the next person in my position has it easier. So, as an organization, realize that while the majority of your staff time needs to be focused on mission based projects, sometimes making it easier, exciting, and affirming for your employees to do work on their pet projects is worth the hours and worth the time and money that'll go into it, especially when the work improves the working conditions for groups in the environmental field. So that's self-actualization needs. And if we were doing this, live, obviously I would have asked if anyone had any questions. So if anyone does have any questions, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer them if I can, or send you to a resource that could help. My email is Chris, that's CHRIS, at RockyMountainWild.org. And then, I have that resource on my webpage, which again is talbot-heindel.com. That's TALBOT-HEINDL.com. Thanks.